Hi. So in this video, I am going to apply the questions we provided about primary source documents to the 95 Theses, the primary source document we're looking at for the Reformation. So let's get started. And as I do this, I will try my best to do it from the perspective of someone who is new to this document, to show you some of the questions I might ask myself and things I might consider as I do this. So first of all, what does this look like? Well, this question is based on the idea that we're looking at a document from that time period, and we might learn something about that document from the way it looks. But because this particular version of the 95 Theses has been digitized, I'm not sure I can learn very much about the document from its look. As for the next question, who wrote it and why? Well, I know it was written by Martin Luther, and I already know that he was against a number of church practices. I think it's important that I remember that Martin Luther taught theology, and he taught at the University in Wittenberg. So I think it's fair to assume that he is knowledgeable about the subject, but I think I have to watch or guard against the assumption that other people were necessarily for or against him. I can only conclude how he thought, not how others thought based on this document. The next question, how does the author communicate his ideas? Well, he's chosen a really interesting approach, hasn't he? Instead of writing an essay or letter, he's provided a list of 95 theses, right? And that suggests clearly that he has a number of problems with the church, or he sees a number of problems. And the fact that they're called theses also reflects that they are arguments. And so I do find myself wondering about things like syllogisms, which are essential element to philosophical thinking, that basically an argument that is logically constructed that leads one from a premise to a conclusion. And so I can see him doing that as he goes through these, that these theses aren't in isolation, that he's building on them. And so perhaps that's a reflection of the fact that he is a university professor and he does study theology. What are the big ideas? Well, to me, it seems like he's working with 3 or 4 big ideas. And I see over and over again repentance and penance. A lot of this has to do with, I think, who can forgive sin. I also see a lot of references to indulgences, so that's another big topic in this. There are a number of theses dealing with indulgences. And I notice there are a number near the end, or about halfway through, a lot about Christians are to be taught. So he's giving an argument about what Christians should learn and what they should know about the faith. And I noticed too, the last few points seem to have a lot more to do with St. Peter's and the Basilica, and that these 4 topics, I think, are the main focus of the 95 Theses. And I should point out to you here too, perhaps going back to our point here, that we should realize that you have been provided some of the 95 Theses and not all of them. So there are some that we've left out. And that does connect to our next point. What ideas have been left out? Well, as I just said, we, the authors of this course, chose some of the theses that we thought would be relevant for you. So we know that some. I do find it interesting, though, that there seems to be a few references to the political power of the church. We already looked at the fact that Julius II was really involved in politics and even warfare in Italy and the surrounding regions. So I find myself wondering, what does that mean? Does that mean that Luther was in favor of that? Does it mean he's against it? I can't really reach either conclusion, can I? I have no evidence for that. What I can perhaps infer, though, is that Luther was much more concerned with with Christians, the average person living in Europe at this time, than perhaps bigger political issues. Now, whose perspective does this reflect? Well, clearly this reflects Luther's perspective about the church. You already know that. And we already know that it seems to focus a lot more on Christians and what Christians should learn than perhaps the establishment of the church. The only time he talks about the establishment of the church seems to be when he's questioning its actions. So I find myself wondering if part of this is because Luther is and Luther is serving in Germany, and he's fair distance from Rome, and maybe that disconnect between the power structure of Rome and what's happening among the laity in Germany is part of that, and that Luther's work reflects that perspective. Now, our next question is, whose perspectives are being challenged or omitted or questioned? Well, clearly, we can see that the church, the Pope is being openly challenged by this. And I find it interesting because we've already established that the popes at this time are really powerful. They control, at least in the case of Julius II, control armies. And yet Luther is openly questioning the Pope. I think that's a really interesting point. And I also come back to the point that we know that that door may seem insignificant at first, but I think it's really important. So Martin Luther nails the 95 Theses to a church door. That is, I think, a direct challenge to authority, isn't it? He's picking a symbol of the church, an actual physical manifestation of the church, nailing his argument right to the door. That's a deliberate choice, and I think it reflects his anger at church practices. Now, the last question that we need to consider is which questions can this help me answer and which can it not? Okay, well, Luther's work certainly suggests there were some significant cracks in the church's authority. And if you go back to our last point, the fact that he's doing this suggests that that at least he and perhaps more people in Europe were openly questioning the church. And we know this too because this document essentially starts the Protestant Reformation. We cannot, however, reach conclusions about the scope of this change yet. All we can prove at this point is that this document, written by a monk in Germany, was challenging church practices, but it really doesn't tell us anything about the church responses to church practices in other places like Spain or France, right? And it also can't tell us if these practices were the sole reason for the spread of the Reformation. It certainly tells us why Martin Luther was angry with the church, and we know that his reasoning is based on theological. But we can't make the assumption that the eventual spread of the Reformation is going to be based solely on those theological foundations.